Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. We have the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for a parallel event to the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, co-organized by the University of Geneva, Earth Justice, and the Geneva Environment Network under the sponsorship of Norway. As we start, let me remind you that the video of this event and the presentations made, as well as a summary, will be available online on the webpage of the event. You can raise your questions in the chat box throughout the event and we will address them at the end. For who is with us on WebEx, at the very end of the event, you will also have the possibility to unmute yourself and intervene live. We will now proceed with the opening and welcome statements of this event. Kindly note that the numerous speakers we are welcoming today will be introduced throughout the sessions. For the first opening statement of this event today, we have the pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency Ambassador Nazat Shamin Khan, the permanent representative of the Republic of Fiji to the United Nations in Geneva, who is also the president of the Human Rights Council this year and the champion in promoting climate and environmental justice in various forums in Geneva. Excellency, we look forward to the guidance your experience can bring to our discussions. The floor is yours.
Bula Vinaka, and good afternoon to you all, excellencies and dear colleagues. I'm honored to be speaking today regarding environmental human rights defenders in the global agenda for 2021, and specifically about the Council's work in this regard. I wish to extend my sincere gratitude to the University of Geneva, the Geneva Environment Network, and Earth Justice for organizing this important and indeed timely event. As we all know, in March 2019, the Council adopted Resolution 40/11, which inter alia expressed grave concern at the situation of environmental human rights defenders around the world. It urged all states to take all measures necessary to ensure the rights, protection, and safety of all persons, including environmental human rights defenders, and recognize the important role that environmental human rights defenders play in supporting states to fulfill their obligations under the Paris Agreement and to realize the 2030 Agenda. I am pleased to inform you that since then, the Council's work to protect environmental human rights defenders has continued. Indeed, at the current 46th session of the Council, the Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment presented a report in which the Special Rapporteur indicated that he has received numerous accounts of environmental human rights defenders suffering violence, intimidation, or criminalization for their courageous efforts to protect water, and noted the states must vigilantly protect from defenders from intimidation, criminalization, and violence, diligently investigate, prosecute, and punish the perpetrators of those crimes. Also, at the current 46th session, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders presented a report that showed that since 2015, 1,323 human rights defenders have been killed, and of those, environmental human rights defenders are the most targeted. Excellencies, dear colleagues, this is an unacceptable situation and one which deserves our full attention and efforts to change. As President of the Human Rights Council, I look forward to the Council's further work on the situation of environmental human rights defenders this year, in line with Resolution 40/11, and to the discussions that will take place today. I thank you and the best of luck.
Thank you, Excellency. Proceeding with the opening session, it is now our pleasure to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations in Geneva, Jannik Gratrud. As mentioned earlier, Norway is sponsoring this event and is also the holder of the Resolution 40/11 that brings us together today. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear colleagues and friends, I would like to thank the Geneva University, the Geneva Environment Network, and Earth Justice for organizing this important online event on milestones and opportunities in 2021 to improve the protection of environmental defenders. As the sponsor of the resolution on environmental human rights defenders 2 years ago, It's encouraging and inspiring to see your efforts in the actual implementation of the resolution. Over the last year, COVID-19 has forced us to change the way we live and work. Progress on development goals built over decades of hard work are being lost as we are yet again faced with increasing food insecurity, lack of adequate health and education for vulnerable populations. The lack of progress on halting pollution, the loss of biodiversity, and the drivers of climate change has been disheartening. International cooperation to address these issues are also faced with the additional challenge of negotiation through the virtual format. We need to be mindful of the need for inclusive and transparent processes in the digital space and remain open to new ways of adapting to this reality. But we cannot postpone or weaken our ambitions in relation to the environmental crisis. We must act now with urgency. While we've not been able to make substantive progress on the international level during the last year, environmental defenders across the world have continued to fight for a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and many of them fighting for their very land and livelihood. Their invaluable contributions for our shared environment benefits us all. However, intimidation, attacks, and violations of the fundamental rights of those who commit themselves to this cause has continued to increase. We need to be good allies and ensure that they are protected from further violations of their basic rights. The resolution passed by the Human Rights Council in 2019 provides a strong mandate to governments and to you in the civil society to increase efforts to protect environmental human rights defenders. It was global recognition that more must be done to protect those who stand on the front line. Taking stock and intensifying our efforts is essential to ensure effective implementation of the resolution. Identifying concrete steps to incorporate and to implement measures addressing needs and rights of environmental human rights defenders into the many relevant environmental meetings in 2021 is a very valuable exercise. And it will continue to prove valuable until we manage to eliminate all killings, threats, intimidation, and attacks on environmental human rights defenders. I look forward to your contribution and a rich discussion here today on how we can make 2021 not only the year of the environment, but also the year for the protection of environmental defenders. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Now I will turn to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, who has pre-recorded a message due to the time zones constraints, David being based in Vancouver.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. My friends, as you know, we're in the midst of a global environmental crisis of unprecedented severity. The world urgently needs more people to stand up and fight for the protection of and the restoration of the air, water, soil, biodiversity, and climate that we all depend on. In short, we need more defenders of the right to a healthy environment, indigenous rights, the rights of the child, and other human rights. And yet, in far too many states, these are dangerous activities. The statistics are ugly. More than 200 documented murders of environmental human rights defenders every year. And this is merely the tip of an iceberg of criminalization, violence, harassment, and intimidation. We have a UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. We have Human Rights Council Resolution 40/11. We have a new regional treaty, the Escazú Agreement, with pioneering obligations on states to protect environmental human rights defenders. A new rapid response mechanism is being developed under the Aarhus Convention for Environmental Human Rights Defenders. And a growing number of states have national protection mechanisms in place. What we need urgently is action to protect environmental human rights defenders who are at risk right now, a situation exacerbated by this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, which has led to weakening of environmental rules, processes, and enforcement. We need the implementation immediately of existing protection mechanisms and the enforcement of existing environmental laws. We need to use rights-based approaches to conservation, preventing pollution, and climate change. Evidence demonstrates conclusively that protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities produces positive conservation outcomes. We need to build capacity, reduce corruption, and strengthen the rule of law. We need to take these actions to protect the heroic individuals and the communities working so hard to protect this beautiful blue-green planet that we are all so lucky to call home. Thanks to all of you for the work that you do. Please take care.
And finally, to close the opening session of this event, I am turning to my colleague, Angela Kariuki from the United Nations Environment Programme, the voice of the environment in the United Nations system. Angela is leading on the human rights portfolio of the organization, and she will close this opening session. Angela, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Diana, and to the Geneva Environment Network for putting this discussion together. It's just over 1 year ago when we held the first meeting of the Geneva Road Map to discuss various ways in which different entities are implementing HRC Resolution 40/11 and how we could support each other in these efforts. This was also just a few days before our way of life across all corners of this planet changed forever. In the year that's passed, a lot has happened and the situation has only gotten worse for environmental human rights defenders. A number of organizations have documented the continued threats against and the killings of defenders across several regions. In the next session, Fran from Not One More will talk a bit about the reports we're developing together with OHCHR on the situation for environmental defenders in Southeast Asia during the pandemic. And in February, Frontline Defenders released their global analysis, which found that in 2020, 331 defenders were targeted and killed, and that overall, 69% of these killings were of defenders working on land, Indigenous peoples, or environmental rights. Amid all the devastation this pandemic has caused, as well as the rollbacks of environmental law, we're also seeing opportunities that's related to the engagement with environmental defenders, as well as country efforts in recovering from COVID-19. At the same time, we're emphasizing that recovery processes must also include diverse voices, because excluding those voices and those diverse actions, especially those of environmental defenders, is to exclude large groups of humanity. Besides UNEP's own environmental defenders policy, we're also seeing the development of new protection mechanisms for environmental defenders and the organizations that represent them, both at regional and global levels. And I look forward to speaking a bit more about this later in the event today. Thanks very much.
Yves, I let you take over from here.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Diana, for giving me the floor for the next panel discussion. And I'd like also to thank all of the participants to the opening session for their really very relevant comments and the guidance also it provides for the rest of this event. We, as Angela just very clearly said, if we go back to 2020, we might have forgotten, but 2020 had been presented as being the year of the environment, considering all of the important events which were scheduled in the field of international environmental law. All of this had to be postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so now 2021 is a bit the year where everybody's trying to catch up from what was planned for 2020. So 2021 is appearing now to be a new moment for different milestones. And the objective of this session is to go through a number of these milestones and see how in each of these different events and meetings, it is possible to improve and strengthen the protection of environmental defenders so that everybody can have a real opportunity to get involved in the protection of the environment and not risk its life or its privacy just for that reason. Among the different milestones, as it has been said, they are not all at the universal level. Some of them are at the regional level. And probably right now for 2021, the most prominent ones are at the regional level. And this is why we are going to focus right now on this event. And we will start with the Aarhus Convention, which is the short name of the convention which covers what are called the 3 pillars of the Rio Declaration from Principle 10 of that declaration. And that is access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters. We're not going to talk about the whole substance of the convention, although it is related. And it's a convention which covers the UNECE region, which is basically the northern part of the hemisphere. And the convention itself, through its parties, goes from Portugal to Kazakhstan. So it is a very wide region. And it includes also the EU, who has ratified the convention as such. Another important element of the convention is that it has, and it was one of the first environmental instruments to do so, to in a way import a human rights implementation or compliance mechanism, which is a compliance committee made of independent experts who can receive. The committee here does not need to be recognized, as it would be the case in international human rights law. Here, all of the parties recognize the authority of that compliance committee to receive communication from the public and of course from other states, or even information from the Secretariat about issues of non-compliance. So in a way, when the convention was ratified and was signed, negotiated, signed and ratified, it seemed that the system was complete and enough to have a full implementation of the convention. It appears that unfortunately it is not exactly true anymore. And this is why we will hear very shortly Mr. Andrei Andreevich, who is the Eco-Forum legal focal point for the region of the European and Central Asia countries. And unfortunately, we have just been informed that the chair of the Aarhus Convention is delayed and will be joining us a bit later. So we will give the floor of the chair of the Aarhus Convention at just before the conclusion of this presentation. But what is at stake here is for the meeting of the parties of the Aarhus Convention in October this year in Geneva, to see if they will agree to adopt what has been called, and it's a provisional name of course, a rapid response mechanism that could come as in complementarity to the existing compliance committee. And I think the presentation that we will hear right now that was recorded by Mr. Andrei Andreevich gives us a good explanation why it was needed to have something supplement, to have something more than just the existing compliance committee in order to fulfill the protection of environmental defenders. So may I please ask Diana and her team, the Geneva Environmental Networks team, to show us now the short video from Mr. Andrei Andreevich.
Here is the problem that we've faced. The compliance mechanism is a great achievement of the convention. However, it is not fit to react to such situations. One of the main cases which has led to discussions about the issue of the environmental defenders in the Aarhus Convention was related to Belarus and the harassment and persecution of the environmental activists there. And timing was is and remains one of the key issues why the compliance mechanism is not fit to address such. The case which was finally decided in 2017 is referring to the facts which took place in 2009, 2012. The line, as you can see, was long, too long, to actually help those citizens and their associations to withstand the pressure that they faced when they were trying to address specifically environmental issues falling under the Aarhus Convention. These situations, they are wrong, we all know it. It is very hard to feel unsafe when you are just showing your environmental position or trying to raise your, or simply trying to help somebody else to do so. This feeling of being unsafe creates a chilling effect on others. It prevents the convention and the whole this participant from being effective. This is probably one of the main reasons, in my view, why the Aarhus Convention is discussing to establish a so-called rapid response mechanism, a special mechanism under the Convention, which would be designed to react to such situations and to help citizens and the parties to the Convention to prevent or mitigate such cases of harassment, persecution, criminalization. I am pretty sure that the Convention will establish such a mechanism. Some options and details are being discussed right now with the help of the Bureau of the Convention. I'm sure this will be further discussed in this meeting. My key message is that if we create a legal framework, if we encourage citizens to participate, to seek information, we must be sure that this is not a fake hope. We must be sure that they feel protected. We must be sure that they feel protected from acts by the private entities, by the state itself, or by anybody else.
So, well, thank you very much for giving us this video from Mr. Andrzej Andrievich, and the video will be available on the site for those who will want to see it again. And so what will come as in complementarity to the compliance committee is what we hope will be a more preventive and prevention mechanism. So it will be interesting to see how this will be developed, how such a rapid response mechanism will be adopted by the parties of the convention. And as I said, we will have the opportunity to come back to this at the end of the session with the chair of the meeting of the parties of the Aarhus Convention. But before the meeting of the Aarhus Convention in October, there's other things we will be able to celebrate, which is great, also at the regional level. And now I'd like to turn to the sister convention, the Escazú Agreement, which is entering into force this year. Carol, it's your turn now to tell us. I know that we are in a situation where it's a bit intermediary period because the agreement is entering into force this year, but the first meeting of the parties, if I'm right, will be only next year. But still, what are the challenges and what are your expectations for environmental defenders in the framework of the Escazú Agreement? The floor is yours, Carol.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thanks everyone as well for giving me this opportunity to speak a little bit about the Escazú Agreement. Yes, as Yves has indicated, there's a lot of excitement that the Escazú Agreement will be coming into force on April 22nd, Earth Day this year, especially with all that we've heard before about the attacks against environmental human rights defenders in 2020, especially indigenous peoples. You may all know that the Escazú Agreement has been ratified by 12 countries so far. Those countries are Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Guyana, Nicaragua, Mexico, Panama, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Uruguay. And 24 countries in all have signed, but those are the countries that have ratified. So it does present quite a little bit of opportunity, but also challenges in terms of ensuring that the provisions under the Escazú Agreement that guarantee that really provide an obligation for parties to guarantee a safe and enabling environment will be implemented both in the preparation of the COP, which will happen next year, but also in civil society, looking at the role that they can play in the interim period. I have about maybe 4 opportunities and some challenges that I can talk about. First, especially with the provision in the convention in Article 9 that talks about this obligation for parties to take adequate steps to recognize, protect, and promote human rights defenders in environmental matters, and also to take appropriate, effective, and timely measures to prevent, investigate, and punish attacks. I think in this interim period, it really is an opportunity for countries and civil society to come together and create some sort of forum and understanding of how will that provision be implemented, and what are the needs that need to be considered, maybe even looking at a baseline assessment or review of their own country's efforts, looking at countries that have made efforts to put in place mechanisms to protect environmental human rights defenders and sharing that across the region. Clearly, there's a situation, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, which has the highest number of attacks and threats and killings of environmental human rights defenders, that there's a need for honesty and looking at the reality of the situation, especially in countries like Colombia, which hasn't yet ratified but has signed the agreement to be honest about the challenges of institutionalization, recording threats and attacks against defenders, looking at their legal and policy framework and how to improve reporting of incidents that go beyond killing. So threats, attacks, criminalization. I think there's a real opportunity for countries to do some of that work now to really understand how that will lead to implementation of that provision. I also think that there is a great opportunity right now for civil society as well to ensure that Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendants, and others know about the Escazú agreement itself. There are many rural defenders who are not yet aware of the Escazú agreement, both in the countries that have ratified and in the countries that have signed, to ensure that they can participate in the convention processes, that they understand how to get involved in any of the task force that will be created to look at the preparation of rules of procedure of participation of the public in the convention itself, and also in the creation of rules on the implementation and compliance committee itself. Both governments and civil society will be looking in the interim period at how to create those draft rules of procedure. We'll be looking at the text that UNECLAC has presented and drafted, and it's a real opportunity for a broader engagement, both in Latin America and the Caribbean. I am originally from the Caribbean, and there is a great opportunity for countries in the Caribbean here as well to assess, what gaps that there exist in their legal instruments and policy instruments, framework instruments now in this interim period. There's no necessity to wait until the COP to do that. Especially looking at gaps in laws relating to not just to environmental defender issues, but in relation to participation, because we know already that many defenders are attacked because of participation requirements. To move over to some challenges, I think that there are many challenges. Many people have looked at the provision in the Escazú agreement as a symbol of hope, but we know already that Indigenous peoples in particular are subject to more attacks and threats than any others in the region, and have complained about a campaign of impunity against attacks against them. They have talked about the fact that during the pandemic, illegal logging, illegal mining has thrived rather than been stopped. And increasing land grabbing and criminalization, and also many agencies militarizing their areas, their territories, as a solution, which is not a solution to them. So I think that the underlying issues of conflict, underlying issues around free, prior, informed consent still exist. And so trying to balance that with the hope that Escazú brings, I think is a real challenge, looking at the reality on the ground. I also think there are key challenges around looking at institutionalizing the collection of data around incidents and attacks and threats against defenders. Very few countries actually report on incidents of attacks and threats, and how they're looking to charge perpetrators for the killings. There is not enough information and transparency on that. And so this is a great challenge. What countries don't monitor or manage or track, very few, there's an opportunity to ensure accountability as to how they're addressing it. And then lastly, I do think there is a challenge in looking at how to build new institutions, laws, and policies, even now looking at what it would take to put in place legislation that would allow compliance with the Escazú standards in the agreement, both for defenders, but also for issues of transparency, participation, and access to justice. So I don't want to end on a feeling of not hope. I think Escazú brings a whole lot of hope to the region. There's a real hope that countries who have not yet ratified the agreement will, during this period, ratify, including countries like Peru, Costa Rica, Colombia. So there is, and even Chile, there's a real hope that that will happen during this period. And civil society is really, really eager to continue to push that to happen between now and when the first COP comes into place. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Carol. Hope and a roadmap. That's perhaps one way to say some of the keywords of your presentation. And thank you very much. You also mentioned the need of having a forum with the civil society and the authorities. We hope also that such a forum will be developed between the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement. We will need it to exchange experience and also perhaps to speak with the same voice at the international level in other type of negotiations. That would be great. And then also to have other regions joining such a forum. So now let's turn to a region which does not have exactly the same regional setup, and that unfortunately is not always very much looked at. And I'm thinking here about the Southeastern region and Southeast Asia region, sorry. And so, Fran, we're really very happy that you're able to bring a report precisely on the situation of COVID, which has been mentioned, of course, again and again, because it is changing the situation and unfortunately rarely for the better. So, Fran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you everyone, all of the organisers, for inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to share some preliminary findings from my report, which is complete but yet to be published. And the work that we did was looking specifically at the role of COVID-19 and government responses, the COVID-19 restrictions and legislation that was brought in, the impact on environmental protection and human rights in Southeast Asia. For the report, we interviewed 30 members of civil society and frontline environmental human rights defenders. And we found very severe impacts of COVID-19 restrictions and regulations that had been brought in across the region, but particularly our findings highlighted the situation in the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Cambodia. And I'll speak a little bit in general about this situation across the region, and specifically I want to highlight the impact of laws that were brought in, general kind of travel restrictions and the kind of measures that all countries had to bring in order to reduce the spread of coronavirus, but the impact that that had on environmental human rights defenders' ability to organize and ability to have their voices heard. And then also I'll speak a little bit about the acceleration of development as a response to COVID-19. So first of all, the laws that were brought in, particularly laws that brought in a state of emergency. And this has had the effect in several states across the region of sort of blurring the boundaries of terrorism and criminal activity and versus, legitimate peaceful protest. And the threat of criminalization is a very severe threat in the region. There are also countries like the Philippines where there is a high number of killings and murders of environmental defenders, but criminalization is very, very widespread in the region and is a present threat for many environmental human rights defenders. So particularly in Cambodia, the law on administration in the state of emergency in Cambodia was brought in. This raised concerns that this law could be implemented not only in the context of the pandemic, but it was quite vaguely worded when the state of emergency might be invoked, including in a state of disruption to public order, which could, of course, like many commentators were concerned, this could be used for political purposes. In situations of public protest or upheaval. And then there was the Anti-Terrorism Act in the Philippines, which again, as mentioned, many commentators considered that this, the definition of terrorism was so vague that it created a much greater risk of criminalization of people legitimately, peacefully protesting. In Indonesia, there was the Omnibus Law, which is a law which covers a large number of areas, but particularly environmental regulations and labor rights. And that's a law which is affecting, mining concessions, particularly forest protection regulations, and AMDAL, which is the environmental impact assessment process in Indonesia. And it essentially restricts the participation in that environmental impact assessment process to impacted communities, so that concerned members of civil society or general citizens are not able to participate as they have been able to in the past. And so then moving on in my second major area that I want to highlight is how restrictions on gatherings and on travel have impacted on the rights of environmental human rights defenders, on their work. And particularly this has impacted on communities that are remote, that are frontline environmental human rights defenders, and particularly Indigenous people. And the restrictions have highlighted what commentators have called the digital divide, but some people who are relatively, well connected in terms of the internet and technologies are much more able, have been much more able to withstand the restrictions imposed due to the pandemic and to be able to participate. However, so the impact has been disproportionate on those who are living remotely, as often they won't have internet access or won't have devices in order to be able to. And some companies have basically manipulated these circumstances or have used this situation in order to push through their projects whilst not getting free prior informed consent or not having proper consultations with local communities who would be impacted. Also, another trend that we saw across the region is the acceleration of some development projects or schemes. And so Southeast Asia was not so very severely impacted by deaths due to COVID-19 or by very high numbers of cases. There were relatively high numbers in the Philippines and Indonesia, but in several countries in Southeast Asia, there wasn't even one death due to COVID-19 reported by the governments. However, all of the countries of Southeast Asia have been very severely impacted economically. And unfortunately, the response, rather than to have a green or more sustainable economy that they are building back, the governments have turned to development projects, construction, and the extraction of natural resources. So we've seen that as a trend. And I want also to mention, as Eve, as you mentioned at the beginning. Sorry, Eve, are you?
Yeah, you could just get to the conclusion if it was possible.
Yes, I'm just wrapping up. So yeah, in Asia, as you mentioned, there is no regional human rights court. We don't have any kind of intergovernmental agreement as with the Escazú agreement. And I think that this would be a really initiative if the states in Southeast Asia could be encouraged to move in that direction. And I also wanted to mention that this last Sunday in the Philippines, 9 human rights defenders, including an environmental human rights defender, were murdered this last Sunday. So the situation in the Philippines is particularly severe.
Yeah, well, thank you very much helping us to see this reality. I remember someone has described the COVID-19 as basically being business as usual under steroids. And I'm afraid that what you have just described is exactly that. Well, thank you for giving us this information from the field. Peter, I turn now to you for the international events, which are also possibilities and opportunities for Milestones.
Thank you so much, Yves, and indeed, I think the giving that overview of the complexity of different regional mechanisms and progress being done there, and opportunities as well in regions like Asia to explore this is an extremely fruitful basis for also connecting now to key events that are coming up at the international level through international environmental processes. And we've, of course, only been able to address a little cross selection here, but important ones, we think. And we're very happy to start with to give the word to Angela again, Angela Kariuki from UNEP, to tell us a bit about the kinds of developments that UNEP have worked on in the last year and the progress that's being made. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks very much, Peter, and also for the opportunity to take the floor twice. I just wanted to focus my remarks on a couple of key developments in terms of UNEP as well as UN efforts to contribute to addressing the situation of environmental defenders. As most of you know, UNEP developed an internal policy and response mechanism on defenders back in 2018. This was a first of its kind policy for UNEP, and despite being able to directly assist over 110 defenders, including through our joint annual capacity building program with OHCHR, I think we learned a number of lessons during its implementation. So over the last few months, one of the milestones we've focused on is on a review of this policy, which underwent consultation with internal and external stakeholders from April to September of 2020. This draft revised policy, which is now going through the final rounds of internal reviews, proposes clearer lines of accountability and will help to improve the rate at which we respond to threats on defenders. The revised policy will also include a more gender responsive and a more child sensitive approach to cases of defenders in need. Another key area of work that can be considered a milestone that we've just started is on good practices on environmental defenders. And this is going to form a large focus of our activities during 2021. And we're doing this in partnership with the Universal Rights Group as well as OHCHR. The idea with this work stream is to contribute to changing the negative narrative that's often associated with the work of environmental defenders. We'll of course continue to monitor and to respond to the muzzling and to the killing of people doing legitimate work, but we also want to shine a spotlight on the good stories, the good practices, especially when it comes to legal and institutional frameworks. So this workstream will be global in scope, identifying these good practices in different regions and the efforts that are underway by environmental defenders to empower their local communities. And the collation of these good practices will not only form the basis of an interactive publication, but will also help us to extend the reach and the sharing of these practices. We're going to develop some new tools and resources based on the findings. This work also fully links to our efforts to operationalize the Secretary General's call to action, which was adopted last February, specifically under Key Action Area 2, to develop a system-wide approach to the protection of environmental defenders to help increase the UN's capacity for protection as well as promotion of the work of defenders both at global and country levels. An important part of bringing this particular action to life will be how we align with existing guidance and UN tools, such as the recently released UN guidance note on civic space. I think it was released last December, and that can also be considered a milestone, as well as other processes such as those that are underway through the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues, which is looking as well at Indigenous defenders. So there are many processes and many bits and pieces floating all over the UN space. So an important part of this work stream will also be to consult with defenders themselves to gather their input, suggestions, and their needs when it comes to how the UN system can converge on this issue. For the next steps, we're working with Universal Rights Group, as I mentioned, as well as UN partners who are also involved in the SG's call to action to see how we can combine our efforts with defenders to learn more about the good practices, as well as I mentioned, to hear their advice on what they see as gaps in the UN system in relation to environmental rights defenders and suggestions on how we can plug these gaps. So to conclude, many opportunities exist, and I'm hopeful that we can also use this Geneva Road Map process to ensure that we take advantage of these opportunities and meaningfully contribute to addressing the often deadly and devastating situation that environmental defenders find themselves in. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you so much, Angela, and it's extremely encouraging to see that you've been able to actually make institutional progress on these things in UNEP despite the situation we're facing. I think there are a number of important points there, which indeed also leads me to our next speaker, and opening up the space of a slightly different organizational realm, but also in the environmental realm, the conservation realm, that of Iucn, the World Conservation Union. And I'd like to hand the word over to Liliana Jauregui from the Iucn Netherlands Committee, where you for a long time have indeed worked also on practical measures on environmental defenders. So the word is yours, Liliana. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you again for the invitation, for the opportunity to share our work. So indeed, one of the milestones of this year is the World Conservation Congress planned for Marseille in September. The Congress was postponed already twice, but now it's planned for September. And for you from outside the Iucn family, the World Conservation Congress brings together several thousand of leaders of decision makers from diverse sides of society, government, civil society, indigenous peoples, business, and academia, with the goal of conserving the environment, but also searching for solutions. As I said, it's planned for September, but we need to see which will be the form, because as it is now, we can't expect to have this huge event like it was done before. So I was asked to present what can we expect from the Iucn World Conservation Congress for the protection of environmental human rights defenders and the promotion of the work. Now, first of all, in the run-up to the conference, several events have been organized around the issue, and a council resolution is presented for approval, a resolution called 039, Protecting Environmental, Human and People's Rights Defenders and Whistleblowers. And this resolution is different than the previous ones. Before, the previous resolutions have addressed issues on specific places and contexts, like certain reserves and the threats to ranges. But this resolution addresses the significant global rise of threats, with a particular focus on threats to indigenous peoples and local communities. It describes trends like the murders that continues to increase, but a certain percentage, 40% in this case, were indigenous peoples, and also speaks about the link, the accelerated loss of biodiversity, and how is that linked with increasing violence to those defending the remaining biodiversity in the world. It also stresses that we have been failing in protecting. It's a global shortfall in the enforcement of the protection of human rights defenders in general. And we have seen a proliferation of environmental laws and environmental law agencies, but still we see tropical forest loss and high levels of deforestation. So as I said, that the Congress was postponed, but we still see the conservation community trying to address the needs that are current at the moment, also during the pandemic. And lately we have seen learning events organized by the Iucn commissions. The resolution is also inviting governments to echo the concerns of defenders. As I said, many of them are indigenous peoples defending their ancestral lands. And land conflicts are an important enabling factor of the aggressions and intimidations. It invites also civil society and governments to change the narrative and show the value that these defenders have for helping societies to achieve their sustainable development goals. On the more practical side, I'm sorry.
Please kindly wrap up, yes.
Yeah, sorry. On the more practical side of things, the resolution, the event will also show experiences, exchange of strategies, And we will also try as a community to bring new opportunities to promote coordination, to counter the risk of multiple and fragmented efforts. So it is possible that we'll need to adapt to the new situation after COVID with the new pressures of the recovering economies. So summarizing, we can expect that besides the importance of the Council resolution, IUCN members will consolidate group efforts aiming to protect defenders, but mainly trying to cooperate with each other across sectors, consolidating actions at the policy level, but also concrete actions on the ground. Sorry for the extra minutes that I needed.
Thank you so much, Liana, and indeed, apologies for putting a bit of time pressure on you. It's really so important to see the IUCN community in stepping up their efforts on this topic, and in that respect, I'm also very happy that Amy Ramos, you can join us. You're vice chair of the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy. So IUCN is really also has this amazing community of practitioners, experts, and scientists, and so on. Please share a perspective from your side, how you see also your community engaging on environmental defender issues.
Thank you very much, Peter, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today, and I've really learned a lot from the regional discussions that happened previously. I think as the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economic, and Social Policy, we're in a really interesting position to really influence both IUCN and to support our members and partners on the ground at various scales. I think during our last 3 years, Kristen and I have taken on, Kristen's the chair of the IUCN Commission on the CISP. We've taken on the issues of environmental defenders as priority and first and foremost of the work that CISP can contribute to IUCN. We see it as an increasing importance, both because our members and our partners are being impacted. Many of our members work directly with defenders on the ground, and a lot of the work they do on conservation and environmental issues directly impacts defenders. And so we see this, or the work that they do with other organizations to directly impacts defenders. And so we see our work on environmental defenders as utmost importance. CISP is committed to supporting the Geneva Road Map. We've had a couple of events together with Peter Larson and other people here today, and we will continue to have these events and to support these dialogues and exchanges to bring greater awareness to the issues through the work we do at CISP. We see our role really that of a convener, so we're boosting international cooperation, we're creating a shared framework and language for building bridges, and we see this really as a year of opportunity. As part of the work we're doing, we're launching a special issue of a Policy Matters, a journal, that really weaves together different forms of knowing. We've seen a lot come out from the realm of defenders, and a lot of this has focused on academic work. And with this special issue, what we're trying to do is weave together different forms of knowing. So we're featuring testimonials, poems, music by defenders, case studies, all different things together with a lot of the academic and data sets on defenders. So that's a big piece that's coming out in June this year in the lead up to the World Conservation Congress that Liliana shared about earlier. We've also established a CISP task force in our commission that looks specifically at defenders and the work that we can be doing within the union and with our members and partners to support them. So that's a big task force that's starting up at the launch of the IUCN Congress. Within IUCN, we've raised the level of defenders to the IUCN Council, and we've created a committee on human rights and conservation issues. We're hoping that this committee will serve to inform a lot of the governance work that IUCN does, both at the headquarters, regional, and member levels. So that's another piece of work that we're doing. And we've also organized a high-level panel at the IUCN Congress that will focus on the importance of the implementation of the motion on environmental defenders that Liliana spoke a little bit about earlier. We're hoping that these many pieces at these various scales will meaningfully contribute and support environmental defenders and the work that others like those that are presented today are doing on the issue. So I know it was a very quick one. Happy to share more. Please reach out to us, both with Kristen and I, at the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economic, and Social Policy.
Thank you so much, Amy, indeed, also for that effort and that mobilization you're doing in your community. I think it's extremely valuable for us, and it also brings us further outside of the IUCN realm now, and indeed connects us to 2021 and the importance also what's taking place in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD meetings that are planned in this respect. Indeed, the whole renegotiation of a post-2020 biodiversity framework, in a sense, that has come to an end in a sense, and what with the whole process of renegotiating that and questions arising about the ability to really bring on board defenders in those conversations, those people that are out there to protect biodiversity, consider them as an important player in the discussions around this framework, and also address their issues as part of that post-2020 biodiversity framework. So there are clear conversations there that are being had as we speak. And we are hoping that the connection can be strengthened, considerations around having specific targets in the post-2020 framework, or consider it as part of a broader enabling rights-based framework for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. The CBD Conference of Parties coming up in Kunming in China as well later this year. So really, we might say that there are clear opportunities here for addressing environmental human rights defender issues in that respect from a biodiversity perspective. I don't know, Yves, if you also want to add a reflection on this at this point.
Yes, thank you, Peter. It is true that the CBD did not have the opportunity to have such a developed roadmap, if I can call it like that, as we've just heard, for what are the objectives of IUCN. They are still in the process, and right now this week are taking place some just informal subsidiary bodies discussions. So there's still some way to go forward in the preparation of the process, but they should meet later this year in Kunming. Very quickly, 3 short points. One is to remember that the CBD, this Convention on Biodiversity, has been developed on the basis of actions coming from the civil society. So the civil society has always been extremely involved in the development and in the institutions of this convention, and it must continue like that. In the post-2020 framework, which is what you have said, is really the framework which will guide the work in this field afterwards. We of course need to have stronger elements of human rights obligation. It was in previous drafts. It has disappeared. We hope it will be back. And of course, the question of environmental defenders must be just as well clearly mentioned. There is a clear pressure coming, for example, from the NGO CBD Alliance on that. A recent document of the World Wildlife Fund International is also very clear on this aspect. Their contribution states this, their contribution for the CBD. And of course, we hope that the role IUCN can play in this negotiation can also bring back this on the table. And finally, the third point, which is a real worry, is to make sure that Kunming will be a safe place. We need to be sure, because the information we have from the field is it's not felt like that by many people who are working in this field in their own country. They are not sure that Kunming, there will be a safe place where you can freely come and attend, freely speak, and that your voice will be heard in the process. So I think it is a challenge for the CBD to make sure that Kunming is an effective, open, and free space, according to the human rights norms, as of course.
Thank you, Yves, for those reflections. Indeed, the issue of participation, access, and voice at these international negotiations of civil society, of environmental defender networks, and others is extremely important. It's both true for the biodiversity field, but is equally so as we're increasingly seeing also in the climate change context. And indeed, so today, in terms of international processes that we've taken forward in the conversation, we had the first section on sort of conservation and biodiversity, but then are also very happy to indeed invite for a conversation around the issue of climate change. And in this respect, we might even say, can addressing the needs and rights of climate defenders be taken up in these? What is the situation currently, and what are the dynamics we might see in relation to COP26? Is Glasgow a turning point? Will these issues receive the attention they deserve? And we have two speakers who have kindly shared their time to join this conversation. I would like first to invite Mr. Sebastian Duig to join this conversation. You're with the Center for International Environmental Law. Sorry, kindly share your perspective, how you see the issue of climate environmental defenders being addressed in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for putting such an interesting conversation across different processes. And indeed, my points will actually echo what Mr. Leder just said about the importance of using those international conferences and events, both from the perspective of the content that they can deliver. And in Iucn, of course, it's the post-2030 agenda targets framework, but also in the context of actually like the organization, the hosting of those conferences. And we see exactly the same challenges or opportunities in the context of a climate negotiation. So first, let me start by actually reminding everyone that the UN climate conferences are the most important UN environmental events organized on a regular basis. So actually the agenda goes beyond just the very restricted agenda that is being discussed within the negotiating halls, but it's a very important compass actually to guide sustainable development policies. And in that context, unfortunately, I'm afraid the assessment is the same than for the CBD framework. Defenders have not been addressed explicitly, despite the importance of actually ensuring effective public participation in climate policies, and the fact that if we want to promote public participation, first and foremost, we need to protect those who stand up for their rights. But also, actually, defenders have faced restrictions and violations of their rights when trying to come to the climate conferences in the past. The UN climate conferences are supposed to resume this year under the presidency and the leadership of the UK. And so we are very much looking forward to this conference to bring more light to these issues, and in particular in relation to three different areas. In terms of the content of a negotiation, the perhaps most significant agenda item that is expected to be delivered in Glasgow at the end of the year is actually the operationalization of the carbon trading mechanisms under the Paris Agreement and the modalities. This is critical from an environmental rights defenders. Yes, because we've seen in the past under the Kyoto Protocol that in the absence of specific provisions to protect human rights in the context of these carbon trading mechanisms, we actually see projects being validated, generating revenues as result of their participation to the international carbon trading schemes under the UN climate agreements, despite violations of human rights on the ground, just simply because the UN climate process so far has claimed that human rights concerns are for others to address, and they will only focus on whether or not emission reductions are being delivered. I wish I could have prepared a presentation actually with the faces of those farmers, those local leaders that have been shot dead because of opposing carbon sequestration projects in different parts of the world that were funded under the schemes established by the Kyoto Protocol. In that context, we know that the threats are real, and it was with horror that we as human rights advocates actually witnessed governments considering drafts of modalities for these carbon trading mechanisms at the last UN climate conference, where potentially governments will have reviewed in 7 years from now whether or not a human rights standard was required in these carbon trading mechanisms. So the message there is really we need to make sure that no carbon trading mechanism is operationalized in Glasgow without effective and adequate human rights standards, in particular to protect the leaders standing at the local levels whenever there are human rights violations. Second, and this is actually interesting because it's the first time since 8 years, there will be the review of work established under the UN climate agreements in relation to public participation, access to information, climate education. So far, this area of work has done very little to really embrace the human rights aspect of public participation, access to information, climate education. And actually, interestingly, under the UK presidency and leadership, we will see a renewal of this work and of this mandate for the maybe 8 or 5 years to come. And so we very much hope that actually the countries that are participating actively in today's discussion, that are engaging under the Aarhus Convention, the Escazú Agreement, and other places, will actually really use this opportunity, this new work program on public participation, to bring light on what a right-based approach to public participation really means, and to what extent we can use this process to actually promote policy coherence and better protect the rights of defenders in the context of climate policies. And third, I will just focus on the role of the host country to wrap up. We've seen in the past environmental advocates being detained as they entered the host country, hosting UN climate conferences, even in Europe. And so this sends a terrible message actually for environmental leaders who are trying to really step up and have their voice heard. And so we very much would like to call on the attention of the UK presidency to be extremely careful and pay close attention to these issues. We welcome the statement of COP26 President Alok Sharma that COP26 will be the most inclusive climate conference ever organized by the United Nations. And we really work with governments to uphold those very high standards to make sure that this is indeed, and despite the COVID challenges, an inclusive COP that really puts the light back at the struggles faced by human rights defenders in the context of climate policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And it's very important, three important points you raise here. And it's with pleasure that I invite Her Excellency Ambassador Rita French to indeed join us. And the ambassador, the vision we get here from Sebastian is there's quite a bit of work ahead also for the host government for the upcoming events here. I really look forward to your perspective on this also, given your long-standing commitment on these topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a privilege to join colleagues here to discuss this very important matter. It will come as no surprise to you that as part of the UK's presidency of COP26, raising our ambition on climate change is one of our biggest priorities for 2021. This means, firstly, more ambition to adapt and build resilience. Secondly, more ambition to reduce emissions. And thirdly, more ambition to strengthen collaboration and support for developing countries. And as we recover from the COVID pandemic, we encourage countries to seize the opportunity to develop green and resilient recovery plans that not only deliver for the economy and the planet, but also protect communities and human rights. Considering human rights implications is central to the successful implementation of countries' nationally determined contributions and the long-term success of the 2015 Paris Agreement. The UK accepts that climate change can undermine the enjoyment of human rights, and we will use our position as presidency to ensure that states comply with their human rights obligations when taking any action to respond to climate change. I said that we want to deliver an ambitious COP26, but we also want to deliver an inclusive COP26. We are engaging innovatively and meaningfully with non-state actors. We want to hear the voices of Indigenous and marginalised groups and experts and activists from the Global South and the wider community as well. Apologies. And I think the other thing I want to just flag is that we are also committed to kind of ensuring that the voice of human rights defenders are heard through these conversations as well. The UK, apologies, I've just jumped my speaking notes, so bear with me for 1 second on this system. And I just, apologies for that. In March 2019, we're one of the strongest supporters of human rights defenders. In March 2019, we developed Environmental Human Rights Defenders Plan, which is to ensure that all our diplomatic missions across the globe ensure that they are taking action to support human rights defenders, including human rights defenders. And we will continue through our diplomatic network to continuously monitor cases, observe trials and raise issues with government as well where concerned. And certainly in my role as the UK's Human Rights Ambassador, I regularly engage in dialogue with human rights defenders, including environmental human rights defenders, and I hear very firsthand the work and the challenges they face on a daily basis as such. And I think it's really important that we continue to ensure that those human rights defenders and environmental human rights defenders are protected in the environment that they're working in, and we will continue to support in that space. And of course, the UK is committed to championing the participation of Indigenous people through COP26. This includes working closely with the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change and the UNFCCC platform. Our Friends of COP26 advisory group has 3 Indigenous representatives, and we will continue to invite Indigenous representatives, both women and men, to join our ministerial roundtables to provide challenges to our plans and to represent Indigenous people's perspectives in our UK presidency strategy. And as stewards of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, there's no doubt that Indigenous peoples are leaders in how to develop nature-based, resilient and effective solutions to climate change through their knowledge and innovations, technologies and spiritual values. And we will continue to ensure that their voice is heard. I want to just say briefly by concluding that
yes, thank you.
Just to say thank you to the important work that environmental human rights defenders do throughout the world on a daily basis in very difficult circumstances, and to say on behalf of the UK, we will continue to hear your voices and continue to act to support you in this very important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and indeed encouraging also to see some concrete opportunities for this taking shape at the COP26.
Have the chair of the ARUS.
Exactly. Please go ahead, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to address the debate and to share recent important developments with regards to the protection of environmental defenders under the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. I would like to underline Article 3.8 of the Aarhus Convention deals specifically with the protection of persons exercising their rights under the Convention. This article requires that each party should ensure the persons exercising their rights in conformity with the provisions of the Convention should be penalized, persecuted, or harmed in any way of their environment. This is a provision which covers different groups, including Indigenous people, vulnerable and marginalized populations. The importance of ensuring the safety of environmental defenders is increasingly recognized as a critical under the Convention. The serious situation by environmental defenders included, but is not limited to threats, violence, intimidation, surveillance, detention, and even killings. The identified existing challenges where appear to report such cases, impunity and difficulty in uncovering the identity of those violating the authoring and conducting of such acts. In response to these concerns, the Convention's Bureau initiated a proposal to establish a rapid response to deal with the cases related to Article 3.8 under the Aarhus Convention. The proposal was considered by the Convention's working group of the parties and was also available for open-ended consultation among parties, other interested states, and any interested stakeholder. The Bureau has currently finalized a proposal based on the comment received. The major elements of the proposal include the following. The mechanism will be informed an independent reporter who will have a clear and strong mandate to deal with the cases. The environmental defender is any person exercising his or her rights in conformity with the provisions of the Convention. There is a call to continue efforts to raise awareness regarding the obligations under Article 3.8 among, in particular, officials of public authorities, law enforcement agencies, state intelligence and security agencies, prosecutors, members of judiciary, providers of private security services, and developers. to ensure that penalization, persecution, harassment, and other forms of retaliation against environmental defenders is promptly brought to an end, and that active measures are taken to eliminate these actions, including through conducting throughout and impartial investigations into all suspected cases to identify and to bring to justice those responsible. The proposal will be submitted to the working party at its next meeting in June this year. Depend on the outcomes of the meeting, the proposal could be then brought to the attention of the convention meeting of the parties session in October this year for consideration and possible adoption. I would like to underline that the proposal foresees cooperation with the relevant United Nations organizations, specialized agencies, and multilateral agreements, which
kindly wrap up, please.
Sorry. Synergy and avoiding duplication. I do consider that there are strong links and opportunity to cooperation with several mechanisms and instruments dealing with environmental defenders established under the Office of the United Nations Commissioner of Human Rights, as well as the Human Rights Council Resolution 14/11, adopted by the Human Rights Council on 21st March 2019. I recall that the resolution recognizes literally the contribution of environmental human rights defenders to the enjoyment of human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development, and the need to develop mechanisms for their protection. I know
Thank you, Chair. Kindly wrap up, please. Sorry, Chair. Kindly wrap up, please, if it's possible.
Yes, I'm just one several sentences. Okay. That today's event is supported by the government of Norway, which is also holding a vice chairmanship of the Conference Bureau. I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to Norway's University of Geneva and Earth Justice for organizing today's important discussion. Let me conclude by stressing that ensuring safety of environmental defenders is a critical issue also in a global context, notably for the success of achieving the entire 2030 agenda of sustainable and in particular goal 16. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chair. Indeed, it's wonderful to end this segment with the Chair of the Conference of the Parties to the Aarhus Convention to really share such a strong commitment. And this leads me straight into the concluding segment. And I'm also very happy here to shift to Latin America, to shift to Mexico. Mr. Andrea Cerami, you're part of the Defenders Coalition, but also indeed working with the NGO, the Mexican Center for Environmental Law in Mexico. It would be nice to really turn to your reflections about what this meeting has brought to the conversation to now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, all, and thanks for the organization of this interesting debate, and thanks for invitation to our NGO. For us, 2029 will be a year very important for environmental defenders. In Latin America and Caribbean region, the CASO agreement entered into force, and we hope that this milestone could be a piece so important for the protection and the prevention of the attacks to environmental defenders. Environmental defenders are key piece for democracy, for environmental protection, and they are at risk for do their job. We are convinced that the protection of environmental defenders depends not only if exist regulatory frameworks, laws, obligation, but we need political will of the states and other actors, especially in the framework of environmental protection and development policy. Right now, you know, and we speak during this debate, the situation is terrible. From 2015 to 2019, the High Commission of Human Rights recorded 1,323 murders of human rights defenders, and almost 75% of these are in Latin America and Caribbean countries. A lot of these murders are environmental defenders. From Mexican Center for Environmental Law, since 2012, we publish an annual report on attacks to environmental defenders in Mexico. And we almost recorded 500 attacks, and we registered 156 environmental defenders killed in Mexico since 2012. This context that is terrible, we hope that Escazú Agreement could be a very important step for the protection of environmental defender. And Article 9.
Thank you, Andrea. Just a wrap-up comment as we're nearing towards the end of the workshop. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you too.
If you want to end with the last phrase, it's okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we hope that we can work and the state could be implement an integral policy of protection and prevention of defender. And like NGO, we follow in our work about empowerment of environmental defenders and legal defense. And we hope that in 2009 we have space, public space, in order to make our job. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We hope so too, Andrea, indeed, that you can continue the important work you've been doing for so many years. Thank you very much. And it's with pleasure that I pass the word now also to Cristina Cambiaghi. You've been an active member of the Geneva Road Map and of course of your important role also in the International Land Coalition to stress the role in environmental and land and environmental human rights defenders, as you always remind me. The word is yours for 3 minutes, please. A summary, conclusion.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here after a year that the world changed. And as Peter said, my role as International Land Coalition is always to bring to the discussions the land rights aspect to the environmental defenders discussions. So I'm just here today in those 2 minutes to thank you all for the inputs and all the interesting information, but also to bring to you that when we discuss environmental defenders, we are not just talking about activists. We are talking about those people, that live on the land, from the land, they are threatened, that have their lives threatened, that are evicted from their homes, that suffer land grabbing, and most of those people, they don't see even themselves as environmental defenders. So we approach the issue as a coalition of more than 250 organizations that work for land rights with a people-centered and human rights approach. So this means, of course, putting people in the center of the policies and decision-making and action. So I just wanted to remind on all the people that are victims, not only the indigenous peoples, of course, but also pastoralists, small-scale farmers, family farmers that don't have their land tenure secured. And for that, they live in a very vulnerable situation. And of course, we all mention the indigenous peoples as the big guardians of the conservation and climate. But they suffer violence because they don't have also their land secured, their territorial rights secured. And we cannot forget that. So I'm very happy that we can open always the discussion to different perspectives and to bring in also the climate aspects. And
thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Cristina, and sorry for rushing. We're running against the clock here. We may extend a little bit, but I think your emphasis on vulnerability is also a nice opening for you, Mike Lemon from the Universal Rights Group, to perhaps come with, again, please, a short and on-the-spot sort of perspective from your side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good to be here. I think the meeting, very useful, by the way, has shown an enormous amount has been done over recent years. And I think we've gone through a number of different phases, which have all been evident from today's meeting. Firstly, starting a few years ago, it was really about raising awareness about the particular plight of environmental human rights defenders and their particular vulnerability. The second stage was, as has been mentioned, the different UN resolutions, including the one by Norway, the different inclusion of environmental defenders in different regional agreements and different mechanisms. And then thirdly, using all of that to really reach out in a much more systematic way to environmental defenders themselves, to work with them, to try and build capacity, to strengthen the protection protocols, etc. And an example of that last point is something that we've done with many of the organizations on this meeting, which is the environmentalrights.org portal for environmental defenders. So lots been done, but lots, of course, as always, still to do. And very quickly, 3 things in particular where I think we should be focused. Firstly is continuing and expanding our engagement with environmental defenders themselves, especially capacity building. URG has done a lot, for example, in Latin America, but under the agreement with UNEP that was mentioned before, we're going to be expanding that to Africa and South Asia. Secondly, and as was also mentioned by Angela, it will be very useful to continue to work to try and change the narrative around environmental defenders, so they're not positioned as anti-development or anti-economic progress, but actually as pro-sustainable development and people who are really contributing to their environment, but also to sustainable development. And that's where the case studies come in that Angela mentioned. And lastly, we should really continue to push for global universal recognition of the right to the environment, which would have enormous positive consequences for environmental defenders. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Mark, and also for making that connection to the bigger rights picture at stake. In that respect, I'm also very happy to invite Phil Lynch from the International Service for Human Rights to give us a broader perspective also. And concluding remarks, again, we're racing against the clock, Phil, so please, short and to the point would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure, thanks very much, Peter. Well, 3 very brief points. First, because of the interdependence of human rights defenders and environmental justice, protection and sustainability, as we've heard, it's really vital that all environmental conferences and congresses be open and accessible to defenders. It's imperative that states and organisers ensure defenders have a seat at the table, and as Eve said, that they are able to participate fully and safely without risk of intimidation or reprisal. And for that reason, it's really imperative that such conferences and congresses be held only in those places where independent civil society is able to operate freely, certainly not places that are closed or oppressive, or where reprisals are widespread or systematic. Secondly, it's also really vital that defenders be able to bring environmental issues and concerns to human rights fora, like the Human Rights Council and treaty bodies, and that such fora develop norms and jurisprudence to better recognise and protect defenders. And echoing Mark's comments, we really look forward to states at the Human Rights Council playing a leadership role in recognising the right to a healthy environment. It's moreover vital that the work of defenders be recognised as integral to realisation of the right to a healthy environment, and therefore that attacks and restrictions against them are understood as attacks on the environment that they seek to preserve and protect. And then finally, it's very notable that the Resolution 40/11 contains a number of references to the human rights and environmental responsibilities and impacts of business. And in that regard, I'd really like to draw attention to the ongoing negotiations regarding a binding international treaty on business and human rights, and really call on all states who support defenders and who support the right to a healthy environment to engage constructively with the treaty negotiation process, ensuring both that defenders have a seat at the table and that their interests and protection are guaranteed by the text. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Phil, indeed, also for being concise and making that link to discussions around business and human rights as well. Absolutely fundamental. Now, as we start closing this meeting, of course, as you may all see, the Geneva Road Map is far from being exhaustive, but it does remind us that we have clear milestones in 21 where we can invite defenders to be part of the conversation. Indeed, we need to invite. It's not at all a natural given that they will be present and extend protection even more when necessary. So clearly, our quest to resolve climate change and wider environmental conservation issues is too big to fail, yet no one is too small to be forgotten in these efforts. And there are key questions that we may ask about how we can target these processes, how we can ensure defender presence, what new coalitions that need to be made, whether we need to engage in new practices. Certainly, we're hoping for an annual exchange on the roadmap 4011 to take place in a year's time by now to see how well we were good at making progress on this topic. So we will end here. And as a former Director General, Gretel Aguilar from the Iucn noted recently, I want to stop naming names of dead defenders and start naming action we're doing to protect defenders. And indeed, I think this has been the spirit of this meeting of the Geneva Road Map 2021, as it's starting to shape up around key milestones at both the regional and the wider international level. And I'll stop with those words and then indeed pass the word now for we've already a bit beyond time here, but I'd like to pass on the word to Diana and Malou to see also open up for a bit of discussion. Before I do that, just look at this Geneva Roadmap, the 4 action goals that we established in 2020. And in fact, we may say in summary, while we have been able to bridge initiatives and enhance cooperation on the 3 other targets in terms of reversing marginalization and attacks, on reinforcing environmental rights, on breaking isolation, there is still much progress to be made. Indeed, as many commentators and presenters showed us, things have actually worsened. The situation has worsened over the last year. And so it's a real urgent priority to boost efforts now. And that also means connecting the dots between the environmental and the human rights community even more. Next slide, please. And by this, I would simply like to, again, from the side of organizers, say that they're not only key milestones and basic steps for climate change, land, and the environment, they're key milestones and basic steps for climate change, land, and environmental defenders. And I think it's our minimum scenario for us to actually make sure that defender issues are addressed in these processes and strengthened. We hear a clear call from this to be made, connections to be made to the enormous domestic efforts being taken in places like Mexico, as we heard from Andrea. I would like just to thank the panelists and the concluding panelists as well for their wonderful contributions. Thank you.
Actually, that's what I was exactly going to say, is to thank our panelists, but also who joined us for this session, to remind you that the summary, the video, and the presentations that were made and the links of the documents that were mentioned will be available on the webpage of the event. So once more, thank you all for being here.